For more on all of this, I want to bring into the conversation former prosecutor David Bruno and legal analyst Troy Slaten. Good to see you both. David, starting with you, how much trouble do you think Michael Flynn is in?
Well, Flynn has pled guilty, and he's given up his rights to a trial. So, yes, he has some exposure, like we just heard. It's 1 to 5 years pursuant to the federal code. But what happens if an individual cooperates is that the government at the time of sentencing will issue a 5K letter. That is advising the judge of the cooperation and a departure from the standard sentences. So depending on what he gives to the government and how valuable it is they get, they will be recommending a departure from prison time most likely.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's where it gets a little bit dangerous, because you can understand why somebody might be tempted to give them more than even maybe is necessarily true, in part.
Absolutely.
Just to kind of save themselves, and that's one of the fears. I mean, I've heard Alan Dershowitz say this over and over again, Troy, that they're on a witch hunt expedition, and his fear is that you take someone like General Flynn, who has lied before, and you put him in a position where he's up against it, and he says things that maybe aren't entirely true. I don't know. Is that a risk?
That's certainly possible.
Absolutely.
Well, it is certainly possible, Trish, because Michael Flynn is worried about his son. He's thinking in the long game. And certainly when he's looking at the possibility of federal prison, somebody may say whatever they think the prosecutors want to hear. But it's important to note that whatever he was going to tell Robert Mueller and the special counsel's office, he's already told them. Mm-hmm. Whenever somebody is going to cooperate, they fill out what's called a proffer, or they tell everything they've got to tell. It's called being queen for the day. And the prosecutors here already know whatever it is that Michael Flynn has to offer.
Well, and David, we're hearing through reports over at ABC that apparently Michael Flynn will basically tell them that Donald Trump directed him to have contact with the Russians. It's expected that that was in part tied to concerns over ISIS and how to deal with ISIS. And that is partly why those connections were made. But I guess a lot of this, maybe, David, will come down to timing. In other words, did he do that as candidate Trump, or did he do that as President-elect Trump? And I think if you do it as President-elect Trump, I don't entirely understand what would be wrong with that if he's your national security advisor and you're concerned about ISIS.
No, I agree with you. Timing is everything. And not only timing, but let's not forget, Director Comey was head of the FBI all the way up until May. And he was aware of these recordings. The communications with Ambassador Kislyak occurred between Flynn and him in December. So all the way up until May, Director Comey was aware of these communications. And let's not forget, Director Comey testified in June before Congress that he advised President Trump 3 times that President Trump was not under investigation. And that is important because at the time that he advises President Trump he's not under investigation, he was certainly aware of the Kislyak conversations in December.
Okay. Let's get back to what they're trying to prove here, Troy. And somehow they are trying to make the case that President Trump, while he was campaigning, was somehow working with the Russians, and his team was working with the Russians to get him elected. And therefore, he may have had a role in revealing Hillary Clinton's emails and all of the things that landed her in some trouble. So I don't know how this gets them that much closer to that, Troy. Is there hope that somehow Flynn's going to reveal something that helps to feed that thesis?
Well, that's ultimately the hope, and that's the mandate for the special counsel. His job is to try and determine whether or not there was collusion with the Trump campaign in the 2016 election, working with the Russians to try and get him elected. And even if everything that Flynn said is true, and even if those lies are that he admits to, even if all of that was true, even if he was talking about that with the Trump campaign, even if they were discussing sanctions, then that doesn't mean that they were colluding to try and get Donald Trump elected president.
Yeah, no, I think it's a stretch. I mean, it's one thing to be talking to the Russians about how you're going to tackle ISIS, and it's another thing to be talking to the Russians about how do we win this election and somehow damage Hillary Clinton and reveal her emails along the way. I mean, they're two very different things. Anyway, we'll see where this all goes.